Perfect. Okay. Yeah, Kinza, I was telling Laura, but I got my hair done for the first time in a year today. That's why I look all
I
like
was gonna
fancy,
say it
and
looks so nice.
because I got it cut, like, and dyed. Like, it was just, it's great. It was a good day.
That must feel really good.
Yeah, I feel very not like a mommy right now. It's lovely.
Yeah, it
I
is
left my
nice
hair
to feel
down.
that.
That's it all
Like,
day. I'm going like this all afternoon. I'm like, don't touch my hair, children. Don't touch my hair. Let me have it down for one day. It'll be back in a ponytail tomorrow. Okay.
You're
So,
doing.
are you talking to your headphones?
So I just realized this is on recording.
Oh, yes, it is. It's all good. Last time, you guys are gonna have to help me remember. So I know that we were talking about mostly tactile last time, right? At the end, when I was going through the slides. And did I go over a bunch of the things that we would do, or we just kind of covered more the theory? I don't remember.
No, we just the
Okay. So we'll touch on vestibular today because that's the other like really big one, vestibular and auditory. And then we will talk about some stuff that we can do about it. Let me share my screen. Okay. Did you guys have any questions about last time?
ish. Like I know, I understand that like the putting to giving them tactile experiences and stuff and what we discussed, but I have trouble seeing how like I can see that working for a couple sessions, but after a couple sessions, like how many experience can I give in therapy in terms of the tactile front, especially in COVID times? Like I don't know how to
Valid point.
faire la gradation.
Well, a lot of the kids that we see, especially if they're tactile defensive, won't touch it initially, right? So I'm thinking a good example. I had a 20-month old, like a 1-year-old or almost 2-year-old that I was working with, a very picky eater. We'd started working on feeding, and then we realized there were so many other sensory issues. So we kind of stepped away from the feeding and worked most on the sensory stuff because there was big resistance now to the eating, right? And they were working on it at home, and I figured, okay, in the clinic, let's do other sensory experiences. So we went to the big gym, and I brought out a lot of different things for us to play with, toys and touchy-feely stuff. Right now, this is not a COVID example, but it's going to give you a better idea of what we can do under normal circumstances and what we can do a little bit under COVID if we have certain materials per kid, right? So if we're thinking for COVID, if you know you're going to be working tactile and that's the most important goal that we have, then we are going to ask the parents to get a TheraPutty for their child, a Play-Doh or two for their child. We're going to put some water beads in a container for them.
So that was actually also a question of mine. If I recommend TheraPutty, how do I know which resistance to go for?
So normally we would have them try it. But right now we're going to take a very educated guess. Most of our kids will either be orange or green. Okay, blue is very rare. It's very, very rare that we use that. So if they're very weak, go with orange. If they're at all like within the range of normal, trying to get to stronger and better manipulation, I would go with green. Or you say, let's start with orange. And when we feel like we've gotten everything we can out of orange, we'll get the green. They're not expensive. So I don't feel like it's extravagant to ask the parents to purchase 2 over the lifestyle.
How much are they? Just for my...
I want to say $10. Yeah, they're not very pricey. And so with this kiddo, what I did is we would work a lot next to the climbing wall at Point Claire, and I'd have the ball game, the one that you push the balls down and it goes down the ramps. And I would put together all sorts of, like I had Play-Doh out, I had the TheraPutty out, I had sand, like we had all these different things, and she would avoid all of it. She wouldn't touch Play-Doh. And so through play, she'd be really into that game. And what I would do is I would take one of the balls and I would let it roll away. And I was like, oh no, the ball rolled away. Right. And then it would roll away and end up in the Play-Doh. Oh no, how did it end up in the Play-Doh? That's terrible. And so she would come to get the ball and she would have to just engage in looking at the Play-Doh and be willing to approach the Play-Doh. And possibly take it out of the Play-Doh bowl that I made to hold the ball, right, without actually touching the Play-Doh. And then I would make a bigger bowl that might wrap around the ball, and then she would have to take it off in order to get the ball out. And I slowly, so the grading wasn't necessarily over many sessions. I would do a little bit each session until it became more familiar to her. So when I was doing the grading, initially she would just have to see it, and she would have to approach it, right, but still not touch it. Then she'd have to touch something that was touching it. Then she would touch it, right? So really slow, tiny steps. And I mean, she didn't touch it for like 4 sessions, right? And then finally she touched it and we had a big party, right? And she very much had the gross face on her, but she touched it. And then she was more and more willing to do it. So we were slowly improving that way. Okay. Or I'm going to ask you to
It's also
okay, when you're not talking, yeah, I'm going to ask you to push the mute. Well, it's more for me. I'm tired, and the auditory stuff is going to drive me nuts. So, wait.
Sorry.
Unmute when you talk. Okay. You can totally talk, by the way. It's just that if you're not talking, I'll ask you to have it on mute. Okay. So
Fair enough.
for this kid, what we did is after we had done the Play-Doh, right, then maybe we would play with some of the bean bags, the animal bean bags, but they would be slowly going towards like a box of lentils, right? And they would jump in and she would have to slowly reach it out and take things out without necessarily touching the lentils. And then we would hide things in the lentils. Then we would have her put the things in them. So grading doesn't necessarily have to be done a big step every session. Sometimes it takes a long time just to get to the first step. Right? And so that's the tricky thing with tactile. And a lot of our kids are very tactile defensive. So it's going to be a slow progression. If you think about grading, question?
Yes, but you can tell me if I should ask you privately because it's referencing the kiddo yesterday.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, because the kiddo yesterday, like, I didn't really observe the tactile defensiveness in session. Mm-hmm. He had no problem with the shaving cream either.
Yeah.
He jumped on it. He like actually asked for more when we stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I couldn't bring it together so much. And it's just like the way the dad was talking, they seem to have exaggerated in terms of how many times he changes because it says in the intake like 45 times. They seem to have exaggerated that.
Okay.
And the dad's like, yeah, he just kind of like likes to change. He likes to change clothes and like looking at himself. And I'm like, well, is it that he likes the feeling of the clothes or he likes to look at himself? And he's like, no, he's like, he seems to like to look at himself. And I'm like, he likes to match and wear brown and he likes this shirt. So he likes to wear them together. Like, and I'm like, I don't know if this is tactile. I don't know. Like, I don't know.
We have to look at the forms and always remember too, that sometimes it is more of a problem for one parent versus the other parent, because that comes up a lot, right? And
okay.
Most often it's a problem for mom and dad's like, no, it's not such a big deal. But then when you talk to them a little bit, dad doesn't do the dressing in the morning. So they're like, yeah, it's not a big deal because it's the mom that's sweating and having to go to the store and get the only certain pair of pants that the child will wear. And the dad's like, whatever, they wear whatever they want, right? And it's the mom going, well, they're not wearing their school uniform. And so it's definitely not an every single case, but it's something I have noticed. And so before...
He seems to dress himself.
Yeah, and this kid is supposed to, because he dresses himself 45 times a day, according to the thing. But I believe he didn't like jeans. Like there was a couple things. I don't know. You'd have to look, and you'd have to look through this.
He likes tight hugging clothes. So it's a neck thing. Is it more proprioception or is it a tactile thing? Because he likes tight hugging clothes.
So when we like really, really tight clothes, think like Lycra or like athletic clothing, right? And that's actually one of the strategies I often use for my tactile defensive kids, because they can wear that underneath looser clothing if they have to wear loose clothing. But it's deep pressure. So it is still tactile, but it's deep pressure tactile versus light touch tactile. Right. And when you think about what's stimulating light touch tactile is what is more alerting and uncomfortable for most of us. And deep pressure is what's more comfortable and organizing for us. So that's why a lot of kids will like very tight clothing. Like I've had kids who fit into pajamas that are 2 sizes too small because it's the just right tightness for them to be able to go to sleep. And it doesn't mean right? Like what we have to recognize too is just because they have tactile over responsiveness, we don't have to call it tactile defensiveness if it's not such a huge thing we have to overcome. But tactile over responsiveness can be in certain areas of the body and not in others. So the fact that clothing bothers him, but maybe he was okay to touch the shaving cream, there's kind of two ways you can think about it. One, you can think about it being really engaging and entertaining, and he's in the just right mindset to be able to do it right now, right? Because it's a play based activity versus having to wear your clothes, which slowly bother you over the day and will then become overwhelming. We did a small amount of tactile input at one time, right? In the form of play. That was super exciting in a new place that he's coming to play. So I imagine you also set him up really well by having something that he could wipe his hand on, letting him choose his speed and go at his speed, as opposed to having to get dressed in the morning, having no choice about it, having only 5 minutes to do it, and you have to rush. So the demand level was different. And that's something always to consider, right? And then when we look at it from the other standpoint, would be that maybe his hands don't bother him. Whereas other kids have no problem with the clothing, but they will not have their hands dirty, right? Or they will not have their mouth dirty. So it really depends on which part of the body we're looking at. Especially if the parents are reporting it, I'm still likely to consider it as a factor that I want to look into, right? And we'll look into sensory profile, kind of what they checked off, but then we look at the intake form and the form that the parents filled out. And if he is limiting what he's wearing, even though he's changing a bunch of times and making sure it matches and looking in the mirror, which I love, I think that is so funny that that's what dad noticed. But what brought us to that point, right? And what kind of clothing is he trying on? Because he's probably trying on the clothing he likes. And is it because it matches, or is he trying to find the perfect feel and the perfect look all at the same time?
That's what I was trying to find out. I didn't really get to the bottom of it in one session, but and they came a bit late, which didn't really help. But it's like, I don't understand.
That's okay. What we'll do is we'll look through the forms.
I like it, so I'm putting it on. And I'm like, but is it like, oh, I really like this shirt, I want to wear this shirt, but also I want to wear this one, but also I want to wear this one. It's like, that's what he was saying. Anyways, we can talk about it another time. I'm just saying.
No, but it's a super interesting way that it presents, right? Because, and I would have to see if we did the intake call with the mom or the dad, and then see if maybe they have different opinions and who filled out the forms and what is said. That would interest me a lot. Super curious about that. And regardless of whether or not it's a really big tactile response or a small one that just bothers him a little bit, we can still put tools in place so it doesn't bother him at all and doesn't limit his ability to do anything, which is what we want, right? We don't want to reduce the stress on the family, because this causes a lot of stress in families very, very often, especially season changes. That's the big one. When they need to get outside and the kids refusing to put on their winter jacket or their snowsuit or their hat or their kashku. Like there's many, many limits to it that can bother the family dynamic. And that's often where we get the referral, right? Because they're starting to realize that they cannot get through their day-to-day easily. So super good question. When we think about tactile, okay, light touch is the stuff that we usually don't like something that's tickly. And if you think about clothing specifically for tactile over responsiveness, and I give this example to parents too when I talk to them about it, right? When I'm explaining to them all about modulation and the ability to tune into sensory input and tune out sensory input. Our bodies and our minds do it all day, every day. So when you put on your clothes in the morning, you get dressed and you move on with your day. And you probably haven't thought much about your clothing until just now, because we're talking about it, right? And now maybe you're feeling it. But normally during the day, you don't feel your clothing on you. It's tuned out because your brain takes in all the sensory input. It's constantly coming, okay? You can't turn off the receptors in your body. That doesn't work. So the receptors in your skin are constantly sending messages about the clothing that you're wearing to your brain. Your brain is the super smart computer that goes, hey, that's not necessary to the activity I'm doing or to my survival. I'm going to turn the volume down, right? So it turns down the volume so that you don't have to pay attention to it until the brain turns the volume back up, like when you talk about it, or when it gets wet and it feels a little funky, right? Or if it gets, sometimes your shirt can get a bit twisted, right? Or your pants can be a bit twisted, and then it bothers you. So your body is so smart that it tunes out all the unnecessary information and only pays attention to the sensory information that you need for survival or the activity that you're doing. right? But a lot of the kids that we see, they don't have that ability to tune in and tune out efficiently. So they either have everything going full volume all the time, and you can imagine how overwhelming that is, right? Or they have one sensory system that is at full volume and the others are really, really low or medium. And it can be hugely distracting in real life. So a good example with auditory will be that some kids respond really strongly to loud, sudden noises, but other kids, it's over time. So in a noisy classroom, an hour into it, you're going to have an explosion. Because at first they were doing okay with coping, right? They were doing fine. They were able to tune it out. And then at one point it becomes too big a volume for too long and the body just shuts down, right? And so, are you leaving, Mom? Yeah. Okay. And so my mom was here babysitting while I got my hair done. That's why. You can come say hi. It's Laura and Kinza. And we're recording too. So everybody else, whoever's going to watch this is Helena. Thanks, Mom. I'll call you after. And so basically when you're thinking about any kind of sensory input, you have to think about what is the input coming in, but also is it a modulation issue? Is it the ability to tune out the unnecessary information, or is it that we can't tune it out? That can be equally frustrating. So with clothing, imagine if you felt your clothing on you all day, right? That's how much less attention you have to the teacher talking and to your friends arguing and trying to figure out what the right social step is in order to engage in an activity, or the amount of gas left to do any kind of fine motor activity. Because every time you move, you feel your shirt rubbing against your skin, or you feel the tag, or you feel the seams on your socks. So it can be really, really distracting over time versus always, I think is the best way to kind of look at that, right? So some, as soon as they put it on, it feels really gross. Other kids are willing to cope with it, but over time it becomes too overwhelming. They can't cope with it anymore. Right? So the kiddo that you saw yesterday, Laura, might be one of those kids that can cope with it for a little while when it is of interest and when it's something he really wants to do. And maybe it's got a fun character on it and he really wants to wear it. But at some point it becomes too much. And that maybe could encourage him to change or avoid certain types of clothing and keep trying on the ones that feel really good because that feels nice to his body. So I wish it was super black and white, but it's more about understanding the two different sides of it, right? Either it's too much right away or it's too much over time. And both of them we have to treat very similarly, even though they present differently. A lot of the same techniques will work. Vestibular, hold on, time check so that I can use my time efficiently. Okay, so vestibular. You guys know all this stuff, the receptor location, right? What is the function of the system? This is a presentation I give a lot. So when we think about hypersensitivity to vestibular, right? Poor tolerance to movement. So these are the kids that don't go on the swings. I just did an intake call for a little boy who's 3, and I was like, he asks to go on the swing. He's so excited to go on the swing. As soon as I start pushing him on the swing, he wants down. Like instantly. So interesting. And so the tolerance to movement is the way that we put it. They cannot handle movement for either long periods of time or sudden movements really discomfort them. They easily become dizzy when changing body position. So these are those kids that bend down with their head up, right? They very much move their whole body slowly versus turning quick movements of the head. They will sometimes fall down if they put their head down too quickly to reach something up. They'll fall forward. They'll be really uncomfortable with fast movements. It's mostly head position. I know it says body position, but it's often head position. That's where the big difference is, right? Because if you move your arm really fast, it's not going to affect your vestibular system unless it's moving your whole body just enough to trigger your vestibular system, right? It's really head movement.
Micro question. Does it make a difference if they're the ones who create the movement? Like they tolerate more? Like if he were to push his own battles? Okay, cool.
Exactly. And so when you think about grading the activity, right? If a child self-initiates a movement, it is easier to tolerate for them than us doing the movement for them. It's also more beneficial from a motor perspective, right? So if they're going to initiate it and they're willing to tolerate it, they're also doing more of the motor planning and coordination necessary for that movement. So from a motor perspective, they're learning more versus us putting them on a swing and moving the swing around and not asking them to do anything else, right? It has its benefits too. And sometimes we want to do that. I had a kiddo whose goal, their goal when I asked them, it was to go to Disney and go on the rides. That was his goal, but he got car sick. right? He knew he was going to get sick on all the rides, but he really wanted to go to Disney World. I was like, okay. And mom was totally on board. She's like, we're going to also work on handwriting, but yes, we can work on the Disney goal, right? So awesome parent. And we did. We slowly increased our vestibular stimulation over a year, very slowly, built it up, and they went to Disney. And he did it. He did the teacups. He did a roller coaster. He did the rides he wanted to do. It was awesome. So you can increase your tolerance. Yeah, like it's totally possible to do, right? It's habituation and getting your body more comfortable with the movement, but you've got to take it at the pace that the child can tolerate it, because if you go too fast, you lose them, right? It's too uncomfortable. So you really have to just have good clinical observation skills and recognize when we're hitting too much. If we get to too much, it's too late, right? You got to recognize after you've done the too much once, you got to be like, okay, now I know. And then you back it off. They dislike tipping their head back. So those kids who don't like washing their hair in the shower, right? It's not always tactile. Sometimes it's vestibular. So it's a really important thing to consider, right? That's why one of our reasons is tipping their head back, not just washing their hair. So some kids don't like having their hair washed. Some kids hate having water on their face. And some kids don't like having their head tipped back. These kids also often did not like having their diaper changed. They don't like lying on their back on the floor or on any of the equipment. Right? So getting them to do scooter, tummy, seated, no problem. As soon as you ask them to go back, it completely disorients them. They're overly fearful of heights or changes in walking surfaces. So another intake call that I recently did, the only major motor concern, there were other sensory concerns when we talked about motor skills, like, oh yeah, they can do everything in the park, except anything where they're really not stable. So, you know, those like swinging bridges at the park in between the two mesures, right? He would only cross that when holding his mom's hand. I mean, he was 2.5, but come on, you can normally walk across that. It's not like it's, you know, stepping stones where you could fall in between. It's just a bridge and it has kind of some movement to it. So anything where he does not feel super secure and stable, he asks to hold his mom's hand, right? So that it's a vestibular hypersensitivity or it's a postural instability. It's one of the two of them, okay? May experience motion sickness, that's a big one, and may move really rigidly. So they try to control their bodies a lot. These are the kids too that you see standing on the side of the park, right? They really watch the other kids play. They tend to maybe say, okay, yeah, I'll play tag, and then they'll never climb up on the structures or the swings. They'll kind of run around the bottom, right, and be on the lower steps when they play Sandman. These are the kids who aren't going to climb. They're not going to engage in a lot of the movement activities, but often they still like to run. Running is okay for them because, again, it's self-initiated movement. So hypersensitive or over-responsive is the one we see most often that causes problems for functional applications, okay? Hyposensitivity can also cause problems because those are our really active kids. Are they hyposensitive, right, under-responsive, or are they sensory seeking? And that's trial and error, really, to tell. The main difference when you're going to see it is that if we provide our under-responsive kids with vestibular movement that they are looking for, it organizes them, and they are then able to participate in the activity they're trying to do. If you are sensory seeking and we provide you with the sensory input that you are looking for, it does not organize you, or it organizes you for a very brief moment of time. And then you're all hyped up again and completely disorganized. So you get too much of a good thing. Does that make sense? The difference between the two. Is that a crying baby? Maybe try the bottle. Maybe he didn't eat enough.
You didn't?
I don't know. He drank, but yeah, there's a little bit left. I think I left it on the counter. It's a very loud baby. I can't believe you guys can't hear that. Okay, so hyposensitive or under-responsive, we've got seek fast movement activities, right? They spin, they rock, they bounce, they jump. In the sensory profile, you can add a bit more, honey. No, it's formula, yeah. They're always on the go, so that's what they often check off in the sensory profile, on the go. They really enjoy being upside down. I've got kids that they prefer to be in a headstand position. They do cartwheels all the time. They're constantly moving. They sometimes slouch or lean, and they're unable to sit upright for long, right? So that when we see that when they get some vestibular input, they've got nice postural stability or postural positioning, but over time, the vestibular input gets out of their system very quickly, and you just see them kind of heading down or propping up like this. And if they moved again, they would be awake and alert again. And then when they're not receiving the vestibular input, their energy level goes down and down and down. And you see the slouching and the fidgeting and the hand to the side, that kind of things. Okay. So when we're looking at vestibular, this is my favorite one because it pretty much impacts everybody. And the one we see the most often, because if you can't sit, you get in trouble all the time. Whether you can't sit because you don't have the postural stability to sit against gravity, or because you need to move in order to stay alert and attentive, right? And then from the hypersensitive or the over-responsive, these kids have a hard time playing with other kids. So they really notice. I mean, people really pick up on this. They're fearful. They avoid a lot of things. They avoid things their families enjoy doing. Under the oversensitive or the over-responsive category, you also have gravitational insecurity. Okay, so it's a kind of a separate term, very much like tactile defensiveness. It's one of the terms that we use to describe these things. So you either have a poor tolerance to movement, a gravitational insecurity, or a postural instability. Those are the three areas where you are going to see kids avoiding movement and avoiding climbing and avoiding heights. So when you see a child who's avoiding playthings, you need to figure out which of those three it is, right? Gravitational instability, those kids, if you try to ask them to be on a therapy ball sitting and then to lean all the way back, they will not do that, right? They will hold on to you for dear life, okay? That's one of the big tests for gravitational insecurity. These kids won't climb on the climbing wall. They will only go on the swings when they're this much off the ground, right? They don't like to be picked up. They don't like to climb anything, really. They're often very good at talking their way out of doing anything that involves uncomfortable movement, but they basically feel gravity 50 times more than you and I do. It's pulling them down. So when they're off the ground, it disorients them completely. When you think about intolerance to movement, those are the kids that they'll climb. That's not the issue. But when they're on something that moves, they become overwhelmed very quickly and have to stop, right? So these are your kids who don't like the swings. They don't like to spin. They don't like fast moving rides. They probably get car sick. That's a poor tolerance to movement. And then you have your postural instability kids. These are the kids who, vestibular wise, they don't have an over responsiveness or an under responsiveness necessarily, right? It's not a modulation issue. The first two are modulation issues. Postural instability is a sensory motor processing issue. Their core stability, their postural reactions, both anticipatory core and reactive core, are not doing their jobs. So that means that when they are put out of balance, instead of making the postural adjustment necessary to stay upright, they fall down. Right? When they're trying to walk on something at the park, maybe walk on the balance beam, if there's a slight adjustment, they fall down. They can't physically do the tasks, and then they fall and they hurt themselves. And they learn over time to avoid these tasks because they're too hard, right? It's not fun. I get hurt, I fall down, I'm embarrassed. So it presents a lot like gravitational insecurity because these kids are also avoiding walking on a balance beam or climbing on the climbing wall. But if they practiced it, they would likely have the motor ability to do so, right? So it's their vestibular tolerance, their modulation that is stopping them versus a postural instability where it's not the modulation or the tolerance that's the problem, it's the ability to do so. They are so posturally insecure that they have learned over time that they can't do these kind of things, so they will avoid it because kids are really smart. All right, does that make sense? Because it's a bit vague. Yeah, okay. So
Gravitational instability, is that like a similar part of the inner ear as the rest of it? Is it like I don't know, I'm always interested in like the physiology of it a little bit too.
Yeah. So your core, your inner core, develops based on visual vestibular, right? Because your visual input helps you find your balance, and your vestibular input is what reads gravity and then allows you to both be stable against gravity and move against gravity and understand where your body is without falling over. At the same time, the development of your core, inner core, and your anticipatory core, your reactive core, it also involves the proprioceptive system because that's your muscle and joint sense, right? So it very much is the three of those working together that's going to develop that ability. When you think of a baby developing their core, right? Initially they're flat against gravity, right? My 4-month-old, he cannot sit up against gravity yet. He can now hold his head upright against gravity, right? But we have to still hold his body. If I let go, he can hold it for a second and then down he goes, right? Or and they fall. So they don't have the postural stability yet. They haven't developed it. But it is the mix of vestibular input coming in, your visual input, because it's holding your head up, right? If you don't, it's much harder to develop balance when you cannot see, because your visual and your vestibular system work together to develop it. And I think it's only after the age of 7 or 8, I'd have to check my notes again, that we can differentiate between the vestibular and balance and vision, right?
Interesting.
Because, and it's the same, you'll see it when you do the bot, a lot of the tests have it with the eyes closed. And across the board, they're going to score worse with their eyes closed. Because when your eyes are open, you can fixate and you can maintain your balance, right? It helps you to understand the world around you, to make sense of the vestibular input that you're getting. It's the
Can
same.
poor eyesight be an issue here? Because I think I remember shadowing one of Sam's kids, and she had just gotten glasses, and she had a lot of like balance issues and being on swings and stuff. So I was sort of like sitting in the corner thinking like maybe it was her eyesight, like she couldn't develop this. Is that kind of like a common thing to see?
100%. And when we have balance issues, good doctors will recommend vision tests as well. And I agree with that, right? You need to check. And I also recommend ear, like vision and ear. We have to look at both, because if you check the ears and you realize that there's a lot of fluid on the ear, maybe not enough to block hearing, right? So they're still responding really well, but they're still not going to feel vestibular input efficiently, because the fluid on the ear is going to be providing pressure. So you are going to feel, if you have constant ear infections and fluid on the ear and you have tubes put in, it doesn't just affect hearing, it also affects your vestibular system. A lot of the vestibular activities, some of our really sensitive kids, you can tell when they have an ear infection or if one's coming on, because their balance will be completely different. It's amazing to watch. And I have a mom who's very intuitive with it, with one of her kids who gets a lot of ear infections. And she'll say, she's like, I think it's happening. I think it's coming, right? And then 2 days later, I get the email, yep, brought them to the clinic today, right? We're back on some drops. And so physiologically, it's all of the sensory systems always working together. But when you think about postural stability, we're really going to focus on the vestibular, the visual, and the proprioception, which is our muscle ability to hold ourselves up against gravity, which responds to the vestibular input, right? So without any of those three, we wouldn't get it. Mm-hmm. Logical?
Yeah, makes sense.
Perfect. Okay. So these are just some tips, right? Be sure to make time for activities like swinging, sliding, jumping, movement experiences throughout the day. Okay, these are things that you are going to tell parents. You're going to tell this to teachers. It's really important, but you'd be surprised at how many of them don't. They know, but they don't know. You know what I mean? Like when you tell them, they're like, yeah, but they really haven't incorporated it into their day. And it's not necessarily their fault, right? Especially during the school year, everybody's getting home at 5:30, 6 o'clock, and it's dark. And so what are you going to do with your kids? Are you going to get them outside? Are you going to be able to do running around the house? You still have to make dinner. You've got to get homework done. You've got to get bath, and you got to get into bed at a decent hour. It's really, really hard. Hopefully the kids, if they've been at daycare after school, have been constantly in motion so that they need less now, right? But you don't know. And if it's a rainy day, they don't go outside, and it's not a perfect system, okay? Encourage active child-propelled movements rather than passive movements. So if the kid is in charge, they might do things differently. They might be more willing to do it. They might do things with the motor plan that will help them learn to do the coordination of the activity. Anything that involves fast movement, especially with changing direction, it tends to be activating and invigorating, right? Our energy level goes up. So changing directions, you can have cones, you can have them zigzag across the room, fast changes of direction. So if you think about rides, right? Those roller coasters that do like really quick ones, or big drops and stuff like that, any change brings our energy level up. When you think about slow rhythmic movements, right? Slowly rocking a baby, right? Rocking yourself in a hammock, those are calming and soothing, right? A rocking chair. So it's in one direction, it's really slow, it's got a constant rhythm, so you're not doing like big jerky movements. It's rather consistent. It's soothing to the body. Often when I think about that, when I'm trying to explain to parents the different types of movement, right, I go back to baby, right? What do you do to soothe a baby? You rock a baby. What do you do to excite a baby, right? The dad's special. They throw the baby up in the air, right? And then the baby gets all over excited. And sometimes they vomit because the mom's going, I just fed them, right? And it's a whole mess. But the response is across the lifespan, right? If you sit for too long and you start to fall asleep, if you start moving, you will wake up again. Watch your child's responses to movement. So this is for us in the clinic too, right? We have to watch what they are doing, right? We have to see which ones get them ready for action and which ones calm them down. Every kid is different. So you need to be the one who observes the changes to teach the family what they're going to be looking for at home. Don't spin, twirl, or swing for prescribed lengths of time. So we do sometimes prescribe lengths of time, but we need to teach parents to look for the red flags so that they can stop the information. So if a child needs vestibular input, right, and we say, okay, let's turn 8 times one direction, stop 8 times the other direction. But maybe that kid went to the amusement park today and they went on a ton of rides. And then they get home and their parents try to do their vestibular activities and the kid vomits on them, right? Because your vestibular system doesn't just erase afterwards. It stores that input. So your vestibular input builds throughout the day and you can hit too much. Whereas other days doing that exercise, if it's been a really sedentary day, would be totally fine. Maybe they could have done 10 spins, 10 rotations. But on a day where they're at the park and on the swing for like 3 hours to do the rotations, they would then only be able to do 5.
I don't want to get too theoretical, but why?
Right?
Why is it like, yeah, and why is spinning so much more disorganizing for so many of the kiddos? I know not for everyone, but for so many of our.
And it's super interesting. And I'm going to try to find the research article because I just did a course and they talk about it. Rotation isn't actually disorganizing. It can be over arousing for our sensory seekers, right? But for kids who do need the input, it can be the just right amount of input, particularly if you're turning, and I can't remember because I was so tired when I did the course, but I believe it's to the left. And so the research they did it with, I believe it was adults who were bipolar. And what they wanted to see was which reactions they would have with rotation. Okay, don't quote me on this exactly because I would have to reread the notes that I took as well as find the article because I haven't read the article yet. But when you spun them 10 times in one direction, it had the effect of increasing their arousal level. And when you spun them in the other direction, it actually made them slow down, right? So it had an increase and a dampening effect based on which side of the brain was being fired. It was really interesting. I'd have to look it up, guys. Please remind me to try to find those notes because it was a really fascinating way of thinking about it because we tend to always do one direction and equal in the other direction, right? That's how I've always done it. Right? Equality is important because I don't want to overdo one side versus the other side. And so now I'm kind of slowly playing with the idea that maybe we only want to do one side if it's a child who's really kind of low energy, right? And really sad and maybe having some anxiety. And I want to give them more joy and more movement and energy. So I'm going to try to, when I have time, look this up to be able to get the accurate information. So again, fast changes of direction. So if it's a consistent rotation, it's not as disorienting as if you go like this, right? With the swing and movements. So does that make sense? Like the boomerang, right, is a change of direction. You're going forward and backward, but it's consistent, it's rhythmic, and it's not super, super fast, right? Like they can maybe go really, really fast, but usually it's more like this. So many kids gravitate towards it because it is both alerting and calming at the same time because they're getting movement, but they're calm about it, right? It's slow, it's rhythmic, it's organizing. Whereas on a swing, when you're going to do rotation or orbits in a disorganized manner, it has no rhythm, they're just going to try to go as fast as they can, that can quickly overwhelm our system. So that was a really long answer to your question, but I hope it makes a bit more sense.
Is that why we can get car sick if somebody goes super quick and then slows down and then
And
goes
why
super quick and then
why
slows
they're
down?
okay when they're in the front seat but not in the back, right? That's
Yeah,
always
because there's
interesting
more
to me.
movement. There's more micro movement in the back.
Exactly. And you don't have your eyes. Your eyes can change that, right? And so you can,
That's true.
right? It's the same on a boat. You want to be up, you don't want to be inside. Your eyes and your body have to feel the same. When you think about movement in a car, your body isn't moving, but your eyes tell you that you're moving, right? So it's two different messages that your body is sending. And so our kids, our adults who are sensitive to this, it's that response that's making them feel ill. It's really interesting that way. Where was I? So doing activities like reading or coloring while lying on your tummy, right, propped up in prone, is actually a vestibular activity because you are looking down, you're looking up, you're having micro movements of the head all the time in that active flexion position, right? So it is a prone extension, but we call it active flexion because you're pushing up. So you're actually activating all of your flexor muscles in order to get into that position as well. So anytime you're like, what can we do at home? What can we do that's vestibular? You can honestly tell them to read or color on their tummies, and that is a vestibular activity. So it's going to increase alertness. It's going to increase the amount of vestibular input that they're getting. So maybe then you'll have longer sitting at the table, right? It's okay to switch positions for some of our kids. They need it. You want to encourage activities that require balance, like skating, bike riding, kicking, anything like that is also vestibular, right? Because it encourages balance. Bilateral activities, jumping rope, swimming, knitting. So you're getting movement, but you're also getting both sides of the body to work together. So it builds both the motor skill at the same time, it is providing vestibular input. So you're looking at modulation. Some of these activities can be really calming for kids. So kids who don't like swinging, right? But maybe they're going to be okay with jumping rope, which is jumping up and down. So it's a different kind of vestibular input than swinging on a swing like this. And you want to try activities that involve coordination of movement of the eyes, right? So in case you haven't noticed, all of this, the vestibular activities that we do, whether it's on a swing, on a scooter board, we tend to add a game to it, right? And initially you think, oh, this is just so that the kids like doing the game. But often it's throwing or catching or reaching out of midline to catch something and bring it back. And if you look at this little picture, this is Alex when she was really little, by the way, this is a long time ago, right? She's in that prone extended position. She's going to be able to move around, but at the same time, she's working her fine motor skills, right? So you can build up all the activities, and using our eyes to connect to the vestibular system is always a win, unless it makes us car sick, and then we have to look at it for other reasons.
Is it still working prone extension if you're using your arm? Like I guess it's working more the cervical muscles, but then if you're holding yourself down, is it really still working prone extension?
So it is. Look at
Like
her legs.
Upper extremity?
But look at her legs.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
All of those extensor muscles are still working. And so anytime that you're in a position that pushes you up against gravity, you're activating certain muscles, and then the contralateral muscles, right, are not firing. And it's that synergy that's going to create the movement. Okay, and then proprioception. So again, we've talked tons about this. I don't think, because we could fly through this really quickly, but proprioception, you can't really be under or over responsive to proprioceptive input, right? We don't tend to see that under responsiveness or over responsiveness. What we see is poor proprioceptive processing. So when I did my sensory integration course, right, you really can't have too much proprioception. You really can't. You just get tired. You don't get overwhelmed by it. You don't get hyperactive by it. It doesn't happen that way. Same as you can't really be super under responsive to it, but you will have a poor time processing the input. So then you have poor motor responses to it. So that's when you see they're heavy handed or they're heavy footed, right? The ones who stomp like elephants all the time, like my husband. Okay, all the time. It's hilarious. My stepdaughter too, okay? They can't feel it. It's like the people who, when they go to close a cupboard door, they slam it shut all the time, right? They use too much muscle force. When I explain it to a lot of parents, I basically say they're the over taggers, right? So it's that kid who you're playing tag and they're just trying to tag you, right? Except they hit you so hard that you flew into the wall of the gym and you got hurt. But the kids, they're going, well, I tagged you, right? I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm so sorry, right? They feel terrible afterwards because they really didn't mean to hurt them. They just don't understand how to grade the force that they're using, right? They're going to be the kid that's 3 that's trying to put the top block on the tower, but they accidentally smash the entire tower down, okay? And everybody gets mad at them. It's hard to be that kid, right? When the kid's looking, they're like, but I just wanted to put the block. They really didn't do it on purpose. They're going to get a really bad reputation that way, okay? But they can't grade the amount of force that they're using. So poor judgment, grading of movement, poor posture. They frequently pop their head up on the table. They bump into things and they fall very often. They tiptoe walk, right? We're often looking for that excessive proprioceptive input in the legs. They drop things a lot. They tire very easily. They have poor body awareness and they can chew. They often are mouthers or chewers. And the reason they're doing this is they're using extra force, right? Either for calming or to help fix the rest of the muscles, right? And fix is not like fixes and repair, but fixing is our ability to, how do I explain that properly? To fix. So to hold your muscles in place, right? It's the same reason we would hold our breath, right? You're going to fix yourself in that position because if you start moving or having fluidity in that position, you'll lose the position. And so proprioceptive strategies, these are important, guys. These are the ones that you're also going to use for our over-responsive kids. So these, at the same time as they work motor skills, okay, they are also the ones that use the most amount of muscle force and joint stretch and position, which is calming to the body. So one of the skills, the tools that we want to give parents, right? We want to have this too, but it's something that we need to educate parents and teachers is when you see a kid that is easily disorganized, that is overwhelmed by sensory input, the more heavy work they do throughout the day, the more organized they will be. Okay, for any sensory input that is disorganizing. So it's actually not that complicated because what you would do for someone who is oversensitive to sensory input, to vestibular input, and someone who is over responsive to tactile input, you're going to use a lot of the same strategies, right? You'll use some different ones. Like when we try to desensitize, we obviously are going to use tactile input for the tactile, and we're going to use vestibular input for the vestibular. But the organizing input that we provide is the same. That's what's so cool about it, right? It's not rocket science. It always feels good. This set of information or input always feels good. Just some kids respond better to certain information versus other. So tug of war games are really great. Obviously safety first, but tug of war is great. Kids wrestle, right? They wrestle all the time, play wrestling, and especially boys. And I can hear parents going, well, they're so loud and someone's eventually going to get hurt, and they roll around and they make a mess, but they are doing this because it feels really good. They're stretching their muscles, they're forcing their muscles, they're putting their joints in different positions to do the extremes. It's awesome for heavy work. Heavy loads, so encouraging a child to carry shopping bags, have them shovel the snow outside, have them carry a 2-liter water bottle from one floor to the other, one room to the other. I encourage families to keep heavy things around the house. Can you go downstairs and bring that bottle up? And the kid's gonna go do it, right? Like my toddler tries to pick up the 2-kilo Costco thing of peanut butter, right? And he walks around and I'm like, oh, don't smash your toes, right? I really don't want to deal with that, but he wants to lift the heavy stuff. He wants to lift the bag of milk. He wants to lift the carton, the jar, everything. It's hilarious, right? And they're amazingly strong, but it doesn't make sense. Like, why do you want to do that? All of us as adults are like, let somebody else do the heavy work, right? Kids crave it. Wheelbarrow walking and animal walks. Have you tried to do the wheelbarrow walk lately with somebody holding your legs? It's really hard, right? Have a go. Ask one of the other therapists there to do it for you, to give you an idea. They'll hold your legs while you try walking. It is super hard, just so that you have some perspective when you ask the kids to do it, okay? And if it's hard when you're holding them at the ankles, you move to the knees or you move to the thighs, and that's where you hold them up, okay? The closer you are to your center of mass, right, your center of gravity, the least amount of strength you need to have to perform the task. And in order to grade it, you will then move slowly away from the center of gravity so that they have to use more and more strength to maintain the position. So play wrestling, I already said. Climbing. Climbing is huge. Any kind of climbing you want to do. Monkey bars. So hanging, holding onto a monkey bar. You don't necessarily have to be doing the monkey bars. You could just see how long you can hang. I've had kids do that. It works on hand grip strength. It works on forearm strength. It works on shoulder proximal joint stability, core muscles, breathing, alignment, because you don't want their rib cage popping up all over the place. So just hanging on them can then provide all sorts of input through all the joints in the arms, right? And you just hang in there. And it kind of explains why you see kids doing that. Pushing a heavy basket. So I encourage families to have laundry baskets, right? Doesn't tend to scratch up floors, and you can put things in it. You could put the other kid in it, right? Put the baby in there, and then the other kid pushes them around. That definitely happens in my house, and it's good, right? Moving, shoveling snow I have on there. Moving furniture. Guys, I'm not sure if you've noticed, Laura, in the clinic when I did the evals, I was like, can you move the red swing over there? And I totally had the kids lift the huge heavy bolster swing or push it or drag it, right? And it looks like I'm just being lazy, which is fine. I'm cool, I'll own it. But I have the kids do as much of the work as they safely can do, because that's heavy work. So they don't think it's anything special. I'm just asking them to help me, which a lot of them want to do because they want to get to the next game. But they're getting this calming input at the same time. Right? It serves two purposes. And I try to teach parents to do that. I'm like, well, you don't necessarily have to always take a therapy ball and roll it on them. It can be built into your day. You can have them empty and unload the groceries with you, right? You can have them carry some books around. So it looks like a natural part of the day. It doesn't stick out. It doesn't make you feel weird. It doesn't make them feel weird. There's tons of ways you can do that. Right? So anytime we're overwhelmed or overactive, engaging them in activities which activate the proprioceptive system should help them reorganize. Heavy work. And we talked about touch already. So let me close this and show how we're going to find the visual. Okay, so for visual, I'll make it big again. How are we on time? We're already at an hour. Okay, so for the visual system, when we're hypersensitive to it, sometimes we're oversensitive to bright lights. We have difficulty concentrating in overstimulated environments, right? So have you noticed that a lot of classrooms or daycares are really big on this, right? They have bright colors everywhere, tons of different colored chairs, things on the wall, toys everywhere. And the more I learn, the more I'm like, no wonder we all have ADHD symptoms, guys. Like, we are overstimulated, plus. So when I picked the daycare for Max, when I walked into the basement, they were in tones of gray, like our house, right? Every single room in my house is gray. We use art to add color, but I wanted like calm and relaxing because we have enough stimulation all the time. And she had certain toys out at certain times. She switches them, has like bins of toys, and she'll do the swap. They have a chalk wall. There's no bright lights. There's no crazy colors. She uses all like neutral tones. I was like, I feel so calm. This is lovely, right? She even had like a carpet that looked like grass. I was like, oh, thank you. This is where I want to be, right? And it suited my perception of what I would enjoy, but also it gives kids a chance to learn about the environment without getting distracted by every little thing that they see. And these are the kids who will notice everything that's going on in the room too, right? So time somebody moves, they'll be like, oh, over here, right? Everything is noticed. Under responsive to visual input, guys, is visually impaired, right? You're not like there's no under responsive to it. It's more that you have poor visual perception. So that's how I presented it in the slide, right? So they have difficulty finding where they are or what they're looking for in a busy environment. Think like a Where's Waldo, right? The kid that doesn't like going to crowded spaces, not necessarily for any reason other than the fact that they cannot find their parent in that space. There's too many people. So they walk in and they cannot find the person that they're looking for, right? They can't find things in the drawer that's filled with way too many things, or the certain crayon in the crayon box. They have difficulty staying within the lines when coloring, difficulty putting together puzzles, misjudging steps, difficulty finding landmarks when scanning a room. So that's visual perception that you're looking at. Okay, just to kind of differentiate between all the areas. So different tips. These ones are simpler in a way because it's hard to dampen the visual input. You need to see it, but you can reduce lighting, right? So especially on the days when the child is really overwhelmed, that's why we have dimmers in as many of our rooms as we can. Reduce the amount of visual distractions, right? That's big. Let's not have 8 million things up on the wall. You can, if you can't do it in the classroom, do it at home or in the bedroom. Have it really, really calm. Be aware that it might be difficult for a child to look at you and listen at the same time. This is a lot of our kids on the spectrum, right? However, when you read a lot of the studies, when you hear people on the spectrum talk about it, they say, no, I'm listening to you just fine. It's just I cannot tune into auditory input and the visual input at the same time. So I'm just looking a little bit over to the side over here, right? Or maybe I'm looking over here, but I'm seeing you out of my peripheral vision, which I actually tune into better at the same time as when I'm listening. Okay, so just because the child isn't looking at you doesn't always mean they're not listening. So get to know the kids that you're working with. Going outside, you can wear sunglasses. Sometimes you can wear a cap, right? A ball cap blocks out some of the light too if they can't tolerate sunglasses. We can be aware of visual challenges. That's big, right? So copying from a board can be really hard. It can be disorganizing. We can present work in visual blocks. So covering when you're reading, if you cover what you're not reading, it can be less overwhelming. You can also break up homework. So I've had a kiddo who got super overwhelmed by math. They had 5 questions to do. Even if they were easy questions, they wouldn't even start the page. But when I put one question on 5 different pages, that was okay. So it's almost as if they'd be willing to do one, right? And then because they're willing to try it, they realize that they can finish it. And then they look at the next page and like, oh, it's just one question. I've already done one question, no big deal, right? It's not overwhelming. It's so funny, right? It's such a simple fix, but it works. Make puzzles use a highlighter or thicker lines, right? So you can use that for cutting, you can use it for coloring, you can use it for reading, writing. So the picture here that you can see with the yellow, right? The yellow is where all the small letters need to be. And then you either are a diver letter going under, right? Or you're going above. So it just provides enough input, but it really works. There's also a lot of interesting use of color in tinted glasses, but there is no scientific evidence for this, okay? But if you look up colored therapy glasses, and it's on my list when we have a budget, I want to get some because I want to use them because it can really impact vision. And part of it is just trial and error and seeing how people respond to the different ones. You can use a ruler to help, right? Visually orienting your eyes to one certain place. You can practice drawing shapes or letters in various kinds of material like shaving cream. So visual is both connected to motor and completely separate, right? But you very rarely get any kind of motor anything without the vision. So practicing all those kind of things in other sensory input brings it all together. You can engage in activities that require hand-eye coordination. You can do Where's Waldo or I Spy. You can complete visual motor worksheets like word searches, etc. Right? So these are the kids who you're working on the VMI skills or the visual perceptual skills.
Is that something? Okay, so that could be worked on because I know I'm starting to be unsure about what can be worked on, like auditory modulation versus visual. I guess. I mean, visual perception.
I think
Are you
can
working
be worked
on it, or are you giving
strategies?
One second. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like,
both.
if I do visual, okay. I guess like everything you get better, but then you're like, okay, well, let's do scanning, for example.
Right? Like you need to succeed at the task you're doing now. That's our initial goal, right? So are there strategies we can put in place for now to help us do this? Like using a ruler, right? And moving a piece of paper down to show more words, for example, right? At the same time, you can do things like Where's Waldo or Spot the Difference, right? Those worksheets or word searches. So you can actually do exercises and games that work on the skills. There's our that card game. Is it called I Spy? Well, there's definitely a game that is I Spy where you have the big board and you have all the cards that you do. You
I
also
Spy Bingo.
Yes, there's so many good ones. And then there's the Spot It. Spot It's a game. We have it at both clinics. It's like a little tin with round cards in it, right? And you have to be the quickest one to spot the similarities, like the thing that is the same in both of the cards, right? So tons of the games that we have work on these skills. But at the same time, we need to provide a strategy for the now. Does that make sense? And to be very honest, I think that's the technique you're going to keep in mind for most of the sensory stuff that you're going to treat. Everything is treatable, I think. Even olfaction, that's the hardest thing to treat, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is your nose, right? Because kids who are oversensitive to it, they respond so fast because it doesn't go through your spinal column. It goes through your cranial nerves right to your brain, right? Yeah. It's really quick, because if we smell smoke, we need to run, right? It's that caveman response that hasn't changed. And so I had a kid, one of my, maybe like 4 years into my practice, or 3 years, and he, Asperger diagnosis, really bright kid, super funny. He wanted to be a chef. That was his life goal. He's like, Stephanie, I want to be a chef. Okay. But he ate like 5 things. Okay. That was it. He was so sensitive. And half of it was the smell. If he smelled something, he could tell me when I had a banana for breakfast, and I saw him around lunchtime. Okay. And I'd brush my teeth at this point, right? He would tell you if the garbage was full, if he opened the door and there was something even a little bit off. You and I would not have been able to smell it yet in the fridge, but he would close the fridge and he's like, that makes me sick, right? If he walked by something and it surprised him with the smell, he would vomit, right? He was so sensitive to smell, which would probably make him a fabulous chef, okay, if he could tolerate it. And so I did a lot of thinking, a lot of research about it, and there's not any like specific way of approaching it. So I decided to work on self-regulation. As an aside, the more organized we are, the more we can tolerate unpleasant input that we are unexpectedly experiencing or have to experience for long periods of time. And I wanted to give him control over it. I wanted to use cognition. So we used Scentsy candles. Somebody gave me all their little testers for Scentsy candles, and we would smell them. And I would take the lid and the base and I would put them at opposite ends of the room, and he would scooter board between them, right? So I'm using vestibular, I'm using visual, I'm using deep pressure because he had to move himself, and he'd have to smell one and then he'd have to come back and find the matching one, right? But it wasn't overwhelming.
Game.
Right? I would hide them in the ball pit, the lids, and he would have to find them and then come out and find the thing. Like, there were tons of ways I changed it up, but he was in control the whole time. And by learning what the different smells meant, I used spices, we brought food in, we did all this stuff with the smell. But then he had control over it. So it wasn't a surprising smell that he couldn't identify and couldn't place and overwhelmed him completely. He started to have the cognitive understanding of what it was, and the pause long enough to try to figure out what it was before reacting, because he had actively controlled doing it for so long. So his body stopped responding as quickly, and he was more organized because we had increased our sensory self-regulation in general. And then one day he went up to his mom and said, Mom, we worked with lemons in science class today and I didn't vomit, right? And that was a big deal. That was a huge deal. He was willing to smell things in science, and it was huge. So I have no idea if he's going to be a chef one day, but he learns enough not to be overtaken by smells. So you can work any sensory system, right? It just depends on the kid. It depends on the family. It depends on what works and what doesn't. So it's more about having a whole bunch of tools in your toolbox and just logicking it, right? Be like, okay, what is he like? What makes the body feel good, right? We want lots of that in our day, tons and tons of that information. And then what gives us control at the time, right? And the things that work, like kind of the last thing we'll cover today, and then I'll do auditory next time, right? When we think about it for everything, you need to have a secure relationship with the person who's regulating you. That's really important, right? That's the relationship piece. You need to have the cognitive piece, right? We can tune that up and down, like the volume controls. So some people, by giving them a problem, giving them a cognitive act to do, it calms them down. Right? It's kind of like giving them a choice. So in the middle of a tantrum, if you give somebody a choice, they have to stop and think. Well, it's really hard to be out of control and having all your emotions when you're stopping and thinking about something. It works for toddlers really well. It works for my son. That is the number one thing. He's freaking out. But if I go, do you want the blue bib or the green bib? And he stops and goes, blue, right? And then he walks to the chair and gets into it. I'm like, right?
I have a mom. She goes, what's 6 plus 12? What's 5 times 30? And the kid goes, 30. And then he's like back to normal. Like he's like, it recenters him. The second he's cognitive, he's like, okay, I got this.
Exactly.
She's so
right? What a smart mom. And that's something you can teach to other families, right? And you've seen how it works, and it totally does work, right? It's really hard to be over emotional and out of control when you were trying to think of something. Some kids it doesn't work for because they can't access the cognitive when they're over emotional, right? So those are the kids that maybe you need to dial up the relationship piece and you need to hold space for them. You need to be there for them, right? And then other kids, it's the sensory input we need to change. So you dial up or you turn up the volume, turn down the volume for each of the different areas in order to be able to adapt to the thing that is hardest for them. Right? If they have a really hard time making relationships, then maybe we use sensory input to get their body more organized so that they can then engage in a relationship. Kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay. Next time, you guys are going to remind me, and hopefully I will remember. So we'll cover auditory. We're going to then talk about a bunch of the different strategies, like the Wilbarger protocol, and we'll talk about the therapeutic listening and those kind of things, like more of the approaches. Because I've been slowly touching on what works for sensory modulation as we go through it, but I didn't talk about the really big ones that are like programs on their own and how they work and why we would use them. Make sense? Any questions about what we talked about today? Yeah.
No, but I have a couple questions after, if you have a second.
Yep, I do. So, Kinza, it was lovely to see you.
Bye. See ya.
See you next week.
Next week, hopefully.
Yep. Oh, there's a day. Wait, there's a day that I can't do. Hold on. I signed up for a course. So the 21st, I'm not going to be able to do the training. Okay, on the 21st. It's really cool. It's like a 2-hour presentation. It's in Australia the next morning, but it's at 6 o'clock our time. Right?
It worked.
I know. I was like, okay, I can do this. And it's Sheila Frick and it's Kim Barthel. It's like a whole bunch of really, really cool people having a conversation. I'm like, I'm in. So I'll have feedback on that afterwards. So we won't have it on the 21st.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, it's going to be really cool. So I'll let you know.
Awesome. Have a good night. I hope you get some sleep, Stephanie.
Thanks, Kinza. Bye.
Bye.
Hey.